Pythagoras. So there once was a guy called Pythagoras, and you've probably heard of him because of his famous theorem. That was important because we eventually used it to make something we all love, pie. Apple pie, chicken pie, cutie pie, all the pies. No, I'm just kidding. Archimedes used it to estimate this pie, which is not quite as tasty. Anyway, this Pythagoras, he was a bit of a character. So Pythagoras was born in Samos, Greece, just next to modern-day Turkey, in about the year 570 BCE. That's about 100 years before Socrates, 570 years before Jesus, and according to this website, about 1,960 years before apple pie. Anyway, when Pythagoras was a young man, he decided to travel from Samos to Miletus to study with two of the true originals of Greek philosophy, Thales and Anaximander. From these guys, Pythagoras got an appreciation for understanding the fundamental nature of reality. Now, at some point, Thales told Pythagoras that he couldn't teach him anymore because he was way too clever and that he should go and learn something new from the priests in Egypt. So off he went. On his way, he stopped in Babylonia, Phoenicia, and then eventually in Egypt, where he learnt a lot about Eastern wisdom. Eventually, when he got back to Samos, he put all of his new metaphysical and spiritual ideas together, and at about the age of 40, Pythagoras decided to start a cult. But it's never a good idea to start a cult where you grow up, because everyone's going to think you've gone bloody mad. So Pythagoras packed up his things and he moved to Croton in southern Italy. Now, to be honest with you, we don't really know anything for sure about Pythagoras. The earliest full accounts of his life that still exist were written about 800 years after his death. That's about as far from Pythagoras as we are from Genghis Khan. But we can do our best. So when Pythagoras arrived in Croton, the first thing he did was give a speech, and it probably went something like this. Ahem, I am a philosopher. Pythagoras was apparently the first person to call himself a philosopher, and it must have been pretty impressive at the time because he immediately attracted the attention of a lot of the locals. He also said something like this. Women are intelligent too. This was a good move as well because it got the attention of the ladies. One of which, a woman named Theano, who went on to become a noted Pythagorean philosopher in her own right, he apparently ended up marrying. Pythagoras also taught extreme self-discipline. He said things like, always have your bed packed up. Do not eat meat. Or maybe a little bit is okay, but definitely not too much. Do not piss into the wind. No, he didn't say that, but he did say this. Do not make water in the sunshine. And when someone asked him, when is the best time to have sex, he said, whenever you want to become weaker than yourself. Poor Theano. Pythagoras also said, and this seems to have been a very important consideration, do not eat beans. Now, it's not entirely clear why, but Aristotle said it's because beans resemble the gates of Hades, Varro said it's because they contain the souls of the dead, and Diogenes said it's because they make you fart. Which is no doubt the most practical explanation. Pythagoras also made his followers take a vow of silence. The first rule of Bean Club is, you do not talk about the Bean Club. In fact, for 5 years before joining the cult, you were not supposed to speak at all, although I'm not sure if this applied to his earliest followers. Finally, Pythagoras also held a spiritual belief in the transmigration of souls through different life forms in a never-ending cycle of eternal recurrence, and the metaphysical belief that numbers and mathematical relations are the fundamental principles of all things. Anyway, Pythagoras might not have said any of these things, but Porphyry, who reported his speech, said that it gained him around 2,000 followers, which incidentally is almost the amount of subscribers I've got, so if you've enjoyed this video so far, please remember to subscribe. Now, after all of this, we might wonder why Pythagoras had any followers at all. Well, that's because a lot of people thought that he was divine, as we can see from the following stories. One day, when Pythagoras was on his way to Metapontum, he was spoken to by a river. Good morning, Pythagoras, said the river. Hello, river, said Pythagoras, and that's not the kind of conversation that ordinary people have. Another time, Pythagoras was spotted in both Metapontum and Croton at the same time, which, unless he had a twin, was pretty impressive. And yet another time, while Pythagoras was out for a stroll, he spotted an ox eating beans. He walked over to the ox and whispered something in its ear, pss, 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 and he convinced the ox to never eat beans again. But it's not entirely clear whether the ox decided to join the cult. All of these kinds of things started to make people think that Pythagoras was indeed something special. But let's talk about the transmigration of souls. This is a famous story. When Pythagoras was out for a walk, he saw a man beating a puppy. Arrgh. To this, he cried out, "Stop! Don't strike! for it is the soul of a dear friend. I recognise him from his whelp." Now, most people probably thought Pythagoras had completely lost the plot, but luckily he had proof that souls could pass from one life to the next. He himself could remember his past lives. One day, when he was in Argos, Pythagoras saw a shield hanging on the wall. When he saw it, he burst into tears, and he announced that it was his shield from a previous life. He said he had once fought and died in the Trojan War as the Trojan hero Euphorbus. Of course, nobody believed him, but when they took the shield down to investigate, sure enough they found the name, Euphorbus, inscribed on the inside. I'll leave it up to you to decide whether this is convincing evidence, or whether you want to agree with Heraclitus, who later called Pythagoras chief of the charlatans. So about the numbers, there's actually not that much early evidence of Pythagoras being a mathematician. Plato and Aristotle, for example, don't refer to Pythagoras as a mathematician at all. But there is one story that comes a bit later from people like Diogenes Laërtius about the day that Pythagoras discovered his famous theorem. When he did, he was apparently so happy he had a glorious sacrifice of oxen. Some say he sacrificed 1 ox, some say 500. Whatever the case, I hope that none of them had the souls of his dear friends. In the end, Pythagoras managed to get himself into a bit of trouble. Not everyone was impressed with his cult. When they started to gain power in local politics, it's said that an angry mob came and stormed his house and burned it to the ground. This caused Pythagoras to flee, eventually leading to his death, although it's not entirely clear how. Some say after he fled, he eventually died of starvation, alone and destitute. Others say that he died from grief after his friends sacrificed themselves in the fire trying to save him. But my favourite story, and no doubt the least likely, is that while he was trying to flee, he came to a field of beans and refused to cross. There he was caught and killed by his enemies, saying that it was better to be slain than to trample on beans. This is a guy who apparently killed 500 oxen for a mathematical equation. Anyway, that's the end.